Şimdi sırada bir videomuz var. Online bir eğitim platformu olan Doohx'in kurucusu Brooke Ermogenis ile yine Alp Bey'in yaptığı bir söyleşi. Bu söyleşide hem dijital açık hava hem de programatik dijital açık hava ya yaklaşımlar ele alınıyor. İşte bu alanlarda eğitim konusunda karşılaşılan durumlar, neleri iyi yapıyoruz, nelerde eksikliklerimiz var. Farklı pazarlardan örneklerle beraber ele alıyorlar. Brooke bugün canlı olarak katılamayacağı için bu video önceden kayda alındı ve Türkçe altyazılı çok güzel bir video hazırladılar sizin için. Şimdiden ellerinize sağlık diyorum. Ekrana videomuzu yansıtmaya başlıyoruz. İyi seyirler herkese.
Herkese merhaba. Bu seanstaki konuğum Brooke Ermogenis. Kendisi Doohx platformunun kurucusu ve CEO'su. Doohx platformu bir eğitim platformu. Dijital açık hava, programatik dijital açık hava ve hatta geleneksel baskılı açık hava konusunda birçok farklı eğitim modülüne sahip online bir eğitim platformu. Kendisiyle dijital açık havayı ve programatik dijital açık havayı konuşacağız. Bu kanala olan yaklaşımı ve eğitim konusunda karşılaşılan durumlar, nerelerde tıkanılıyor, nerelerde başarılı olunuyor, farklı pazarlardan örnekler, bunların hepsini masaya yatıracağız. Hi Brooke, thank you very much for joining us in this IB Digital Out of Home webinar for IB Turkey.
Thank you for having me.
So let's kick off with you perhaps telling us about yourself, your career in digital out of home, and Doohx, which is your educational platform.
So yeah, I've been in out of home now for over 10 years now, revealing my age a bit. I started in Australia at an out of home buy at Posterscope for a few years, so on the buy side, before moving over to a publisher in Australia. And then I moved over to Europe and continued with that publisher over here. And, sort of 5-7 years ago, started getting into not just the digital out of home side of things, but more the programmatic digital out of home side of things. Obviously, we dealt with some campaigns together back in the day. Yeah. And, a big part of my role there was business development. And it was, going into agencies and teaching them about either digital out of home as a medium or, programmatic, how that's coming into the fold, how that's going to evolve things, and so on. And it just became evident very quickly that a 1-hour session, with each individual team and agencies wasn't really going to move the needle of education so quickly. So it was during lockdown, actually, I had the idea to put Doohx together and sort of make education digital out of home more readily available, online, especially since with programmatic coming more into the fold, there was a lot more interest from outside the industry as well. To learn more about the medium, to learn more about how programmatic plays a role. And, we launched our first course, P2 101, 4 years ago now. And now we have 6 different certifications that cover sort of all aspects from static to digital and programmatic in between.
Excellent. So you have a lot of modules now, I know, and a lot of contributors as well from different parts of the industry. But let's talk about the audience and your subscriber base essentially. What does it comprise of? Like, where do you see the most students coming from?
It's interesting for us because we have quite a holistic view, sort of, on a global basis. And interestingly for me, the majority of students that we see come from, outside the out of home sphere. Whether that's digital agencies, new tech platforms that are evolving, maybe omni-channel DSPs that are interested in digital out of home now. It seems to be more people outside the medium learning about the medium through the channel of programmatic, as opposed to people already within the industry trying to sort of move forward with the programmatic knowledge. And there's also an interesting balance between the markets that they come from as well. So it's less from the sort of more established and westernized markets and more from the emerging ones. So, markets like South Africa, Mexico, the UAE now. There's been a lot more interest of digital teams from these areas, because I think for them, it's not just programmatic digital out of home as a next stage of evolution. Digital out of home itself is being established in a lot of these markets, like new networks are being established. So they have this opportunity to do, to do it right from the start, basically. So there's a lot more traction in those markets. And I think the fact that we're available in, I think it's 9 different languages now, has certainly helped that as well.
Well, that's fantastic. One of the big discussions is who needs to get educated, or who needs to handle maybe the newer forms of digital out-of-home, such as programmatic digital out-of-home buying.
I think there's a bit more of an emphasis put on the sort of, cannibalization of budgets and that sort of like scare factor than is probably the reality when it comes to programmatic out-of-home. The majority of campaigns that I've seen and clients that I've seen doing programmatic campaigns, it tends to be incremental revenue and new clients that are coming in rather than existing money sort of switching over. So out-of-home specialists, for the time being, have their role booking, direct campaigns as they always have. For a programmatic perspective, it makes sense to have out-of-home not so much in its own silo anymore, because it's becoming a lot more part of the sort of, the multi-channel buy. So there is an argument to be made that it should be done by the team that's booking all the other programmatic, so that the platforms can work well and speak to each other more efficiently. But for the out-of-home specialists, if they're the ones doing the buying, I've seen really good examples like Kinetic in Germany many years ago already set up a dedicated team within their out-of-home specialists to deal with programmatic campaigns. And I feel that that's more effective for businesses, simply because, as I said, it's a completely different client base that you're dealing with most of the time. But it's also a completely different language that you're speaking, going from reach and frequencies to impressions, dealing with more omni-channel aspects. It's a different way of dealing with clients and different clients that you're dealing with. So in my opinion, it makes more sense now to either keep it as a separate team with out-of-home specialists or fully integrated within the sort of omni-channel team, so that it can be really utilized to its maximum capacity, aligning with the other formats that are being booked.
Just linking to that, would you say that maybe the independent digital-only agencies are playing a part in growing digital out-of-home?
The programmatic background that they have is adapting to, obviously, the programmatic buys in out-of-home. The issue that they face then with out-of-home is not necessarily the programmatic aspect, although there are some differences between, obviously, programmatic and out-of-home versus online. But they're certainly bringing in their programmatic expertise, which makes it much easier for them to adapt and sort of activate these programmatic campaigns, because they're so used to how it all works. Whereas with the traditional out-of-home agency, there's so many different factors that have to adapt and change, from, finance, from how it's billed, how the creative is done, how it's planned, how it's bought, the contract, etc. So it's just a much easier conversation to have with these digital agencies. Like we sort of touched on before, out-of-home has always kind of been in its, in a bit more of a silo compared to the other mediums, just because of the sort of more manual nature of how it's booked, because it's a combination of static and digital. It's not only digital. So it's sort of been a little bit untouchable for these teams in terms of really fully integrating it with, the broader plans that they have. And it also, until programmatic came along and, we have sort of non-guaranteed activity and stuff like that, it wasn't even really flexible enough to, really complement these other, plans that they're doing for the digital mediums. Now we can cherry pick locations and times and, activate based on certain triggers and all this sort of stuff. So it makes it a lot more easy to integrate this into a broader plan, because it can complement it so much better. And in terms of creative as well, I mean, creative is now getting a lot smarter and out-of-home compared to what it's been before. So it makes it much easier to sort of bridge that gap between online and offline, and really kind of follow that consumer journey throughout the day with complementary creatives and activations.
So the creative point, I'm glad you mentioned it, because it's something that's very close to my heart. So dynamic creative, obviously, that's something that should play a central part in your strategy, I imagine, for digital out-of-home, simply because the digital out-of-home screen, you're able to version your creative in real time. So why not? With the right technology, you're able to understand the context, you're able to understand maybe different audiences that are around, and respond as well to the environment. So why not do what you probably do on online and do this digital out of home, and yeah, and then maybe link the two together. So the creative aspect is really important, and it is a module that I think you have already in your curriculum. When the client, whether it's the brand or the agency, realizes what is possible with technology in order to version the creative in real time and really make it speak to the moment, it seems to be quite late in the planning process.
100%, and I think it's really a two-way street as well. The creative agency advising, what's actually possible, so that the planners can structure that within for their buyer to see, what executions they actually want to go ahead with. Yeah. But just as much the other way around, to say to the creative guys, hey, let's explain to you the mediums we're using, the environments we're in, and why we're doing it, and what kind of mediums they are. Have they got a high dwell time, a low dwell time? Is it a small format? Is it a large format? Beyond just the the pixels of what's going on the screen, they should really understand better, more about the environment and the inventory that's being used, because that has a huge influence, I think, on the creative that's going to be actually effective on these locations. So it's a bit of a two-way street, knowing what's possible and then knowing what it's actually going to be shown on, so that you can execute it in the best way that's going to be the most impactful on that medium.
One thing that came up in our survey, so we did a local survey with the demand side, so with brands and agencies, to ask them about programmatic digital out of home, specifically whether or not they're active in it, if they are active in it, how do they use it, what are the things that they see as missing in the area. One of them was education, funnily enough. So I would recommend anyone to sign up on your platform to get up to speed with everything out of home. But one of the other topics was measurement, and the lack of it specifically. So the measurement question is a bit of a tricky one, because it's something that's very difficult to standardize, and especially across different regions and markets. What do you have to say generally about the measurement question, and what have you seen work, and what have you seen hasn't actually been too successful?
I mean, it's sort of the ongoing discussion out of home, isn't it? Like what the golden standard should be, how it should be done. And the fact of the matter is, every different format is different, and we're never going to find the sort of perfectly universal measurement for out of home. And even if we did, it would be measuring something like impressions, which for something like online, that makes perfect sense. But are the benefits of out of home how many impressions you hit? Not necessarily. There's arguments to be made about campaign awareness and brand identity and recall and all these wonderful things that sort of out of home specializes in, but can't be directly attributed to the number of impressions that you hit. So I'm not sure the conversation should really be about how can we measure impressions so specifically, and maybe it should be more around reshaping that value proposition of out of home to really highlight the benefits, because you're not doing it to buy impressions one-to-one. That's online's job. It's the medium has its strengths, and that's not it. It's more sort of nuanced than that. So maybe there should be more education around how we're presenting those results to clients to really highlight the actual benefits of the medium, rather than trying to fit a square peg into a round hole of just saying, here's some precise impression measurements, which is just not necessarily telling the whole story.
Yeah, that's one thing that we've seen. Buyers from online backgrounds have come in and first started to work with us or plan, execute campaigns, and they're looking at these impression figures that may be 5 or 6 digits spread across many days. And when you translate that into how much screen time or how much share of voice you've actually achieved, or whether or not the client actually saw their creative when they were in front of the screen, it's sometimes sometimes there's a bit of a disappointment there. So what you say, I completely agree with. And it is important, isn't it, to also control maybe your exposure of frequency as well. Like, how often are you out there to actually hammer in the message, rather than accumulating a grand total number of impressions?
Well, that's the thing, and depending on the network that you're dealing with, 10 million impressions might be a lot to one and hardly anything on another. If, their network's made up of 10,000 screens, across gyms or something, nationally, that's not a big number. Whereas if you're looking at a billboard or something, then obviously it's a different story. So it comes down, first of all, to understanding the mediums that you're buying and what impressions look like on any individual network. They're calculated slightly differently by everyone. They're calculated differently by environment. So understanding what you're buying, first of all, is going to really inform that conversation about impressions, because, what is an impressive number if you don't really understand, what you're buying. Yeah. So, and once they understand that, then they can understand frequency capping, and then they can budget appropriately. I've seen people with more than enough budget, but they don't spend enough on each individual publisher or on each individual network to really have an effective campaign, because they don't know what it looks like to have an effective campaign. They think 20 million impressions, okay, that sounds great, but that's only once every 9 loops or something. Do you know what I mean? So there's an education factor there that has to happen through the publishers as well, to inform what impressions look like on a network, what that translates to in terms of, effectiveness, and what buyers should be aware of when they're trying to have an effective campaign on any given network.
One other hot topic, obviously, is AI. Have you seen any applications of AI in digital out of home?
I mean, not really yet. I think there's a lot of potential for it, whether that's for, campaign planning, whether that's for, optimization in the future, having it running in the background, doing that optimization for you and the monitoring for you, putting together the post-campaign reporting for you, the creative side of things, whether that's creating them or, finding new data sources. Or, there's a million different applications that you can do.
Okay, so back to your platform, Doohx. What are the most popular modules, you would say, where you've had the most success?
I think PDO 101 is still our most popular. It was our first one, and it's still our most popular, because I think people really appreciate having that introduction into the vernacular that's used, the terminology, the basics of how it's applied, what it will mean to buyers, what it will mean to sellers. It gives a really good overview of the ABCs, basically, of programmatic do. And then, interestingly enough, after that, I think the two specialized courses, so PD for buyers and PD for publishers, is the next one that's probably the most popular, because I think once people have got the foundations right, they want to see how it specifically applies to their end of the spectrum, understandably so. So that seems to be the sort of track that most people do, the sort of introduction, and then a more in-depth dive into one side or the other.
Are there any other maybe new areas, new modules you're looking to add?
Well, oddly enough, AI is the next one that we're going to be doing. Okay. There's been a lot of questions. I think you've probably seen the same in market about, what the possibilities are, how it could evolve, and also a bit of putting people's minds at ease that it's not going to take over all the jobs in out of home, as it's going to apparently in every industry out there. So yeah, we're putting together not necessarily a full certification, but certainly a mini certification about the impacts that it could have, how it can be useful, how it could potentially be a bit harmful, generic creatives and things like that if people get too lazy with just trusting it to AI. But it's an interesting area to sort of explore further, because there's a lot of questions being raised about it, obviously, out there.
All right. Any other topics you want to cover, Brooke, that maybe we haven't?
For the people listening, we do have a new initiative that we're launching. As we was touching on before, I think small businesses are the sort of key driver in a lot of markets for out of home. That's certainly who we're seeing taking on education in digital out of home, through the Doohx platform, at least. And I think the reason for that is simply because, first of all, they're in emerging markets who are, as I said, starting from scratch with digital out of home, as well as the programmatic side of things. So they're really looking to build the foundations of digital out of home correctly to allow for programmatic to take hold in the future. But also, just because they're smaller businesses, they're much more nimble and adaptable and agile in terms of innovating and taking on change. So it's exciting to see that there's so much traction there, but obviously resources can be limited to these smaller businesses. So we're having a new initiative launch, the Small Business Initiative, where we're basically subsidizing 80% of the cost of education for them. For those with employees up to 20 and then again up to 50, there'll be a flat rate. And they'll also receive an equivalent amount of accesses to share with clients as well, or key stakeholders that they feel would benefit, just to really support that sort of initiative and innovation across markets globally.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Brooke. I love what you're doing with Doohx, and it was great to talk to you.
No worries.